Um, so just wanted to say that you'll have 30 minutes to go over everything for your whole presentation and like 10 minutes for questions. And what I was hoping is, so you've got a topic, right? You're picking your kind of biomarker of interest and how it relates to like your research interest specifically. So the first like 20 minutes should be educational, where you're talking about the previous research on, for example, I know Selena's interested in like, brain changes and THC use. So that's great. So you're educating people about that. Or maybe it's stress and its effects on the HPG or the HPA axis in the case of Jessica. So I think uh, everyone, Danielle, you have a topic picked out, right, for your project, for your presentation?
Yes, I don't know if I ever emailed you. I was gonna look at stress through cortisol and then exercise.
Okay, so the effects of exercise on cortisol and cortisol on exercise.
Yes.
Okay, it's a bidirectional relationship for sure.
Yeah.
Cool. That'll be interesting. Cool. So, and then the last kind of 10-15 minutes are you're thinking about a dream study where you would integrate a biomarker into it, at least one. And so, what questions you're going to answer, how you would answer it with your research design, and then give us as many specifics as you can regarding how to measure that specific biomarker in that context. So, I know like Danielle, we've talked about cortisol a lot, but what are some of the things you'd want to consider when looking at exercise, for example, specifically? Um, and yeah, and then there'll be like 10-15 minutes for questions. Any questions on this presentation? No, no. Okay. And then the last week of the class, week 16, we'll just focus on review. It'll be review for the final. We'll have a Jeopardy game again, like last time. The final format's going to be very similar to the midterm. With the exception that you'll have a lot more time. So instead of only an hour and 15 minutes, you'll have 3 hours. And so because of that, the last couple questions will be more in depth. So I'll ask for like, a couple paragraphs on how stress, for example, affects every single system in the body that we've gone through. So yeah, and I'll give you some example questions there. That's where we're at. We have no more biomarker papers due, so that's great. And then I just saw that I forgot to put the readings up on CAT courses, but it's on the syllabus. So I figured if you guys could, you know, you're PhD students, I'm sure you know how to look up articles, but I will put those up for next week um, as well, just for your convenience. So no questions. So I should preface this presentation by saying I am not an addiction biology researcher. So this is a really new area for me. So I spent many hours this week trying to figure out what's going on in the brain with addiction and substance use. So this lecture is going to be pretty basic. Um, and I'm happy, because we have some people who are studying this, like Natalie and Selena. So if there's things you want to add or that I'm missing, please feel free. But basically, today I'm going to talk about how drugs impact the brain, and then how addiction kind of evolves over time from a biological perspective. And then finally, we'll spend time on looking at individual differences in drug addiction vulnerability, specifically focusing on genetic influences and then environmental influences like stress and social concepts. So that's the plan. Um, so you can define addiction in a lot of ways, but the most common one is just the idea that addiction is when the body becomes physically or psychologically dependent on a substance over time. Um, so the CDC defines addiction as a chronic, relapsing brain disease that is characterized by compulsive drug-seeking behavior and use, despite its harmful consequences. It's considered a brain disease because drug use over time does change the brain's chemistry and even structural and functional components of the brain, and make people more likely to use drugs um, over time. So just a few definitions. So addiction again is when you're physically and psychologically typically dependent on a substance. And so if you don't have that substance, you'll usually experience, extreme withdrawal symptoms, could even lead to death, especially with physical dependence and things like alcoholism or opioid use. But before you get kind of to the most extreme, a lot of people will have substance use disorders that will then turn into addiction. So this is problematic behavior associated with, overuse of a substance over the recommended amount. And typically people will have a substance use disorder and then go into full blown addiction, but people can go in and out of those. So from addiction to substance use disorders. And then more broadly within that are just risky substance use behaviors. So there's a large swath of the public population that wouldn't be, characterized as having an addiction, but maybe they binge drink, let's say once a month. They'll have, 12 drinks and vomit, and that's like just a normal part of their life. That would be considered a risky substance use, but not necessarily a substance use disorder or an addiction. Um, There's a lot of drug use in the US. And so this data is quite old, but I was looking for more recent figures from the CDC, but it looks like I couldn't find a nice, as pretty a figure. But in terms of the general consensus of the most commonly abused drugs, they're definitely alcohol's number one. Marijuana is number two, and then pain relievers are the fastest growing. So prescription drug use and pain relievers are the fastest growing sources of addiction disorders in the United States. Um, According to the CDC, they take a biopsychosocial model, which shouldn't be surprising in this class. Risk factors for addiction include, uh, problematic stressors in childhood, so early life abuse, poor parental supervision, poor social skills, um, availability of drugs in schools, drug experimentation, and poverty. And so then the protective factors would be the opposite of that. So good self-control, parental monitoring and support, positive relationships, academic competence, anti-school drug policies, which is and neighborhood pride. So those are all quite general. And so I wanted to try to dig into like what is going on in the brain when you take drugs, and how does that then translate into just an addiction disorder. And then on top of that, so this keep this in your mind. We'll come back to this at the end after we kind of outline the biology of addiction. But this is all kind of shown in the literature, but I hope by the end of this, you'll kind of understand how some of these things might fit into the biology. Addictions could also be characterized as a developmental disorder, in large part because there seems to be critical periods where people are especially high risk of addiction. And the most important critical period is during adolescence. So most people who develop an addiction will have at least, some substance use disorder during adolescence. So in part because um, one of the major components of when we look at the brain regions associated with addiction, things like executive control, executive functioning, that's certainly, not fully online during adolescence. And so, because of that, the reward centers are fully online. And so you get a lot of reward, not a lot of executive control. Those brain regions still aren't well connected. And so it's especially vulnerable time in which drugs can really hijack the teenage brain, and actually cause structural changes over time that are going to put that person at risk for drug use throughout the lifespan. So addiction is thought of as a brain disease. Your reading this week, if you looked at it, was kind of talking about what, why that is, and um, kind of talking about the history of science of how addiction became thought of as a disease. Because before it was thought of as a disease, it was kind of thought this not in this non-scientific way, this moralizing way, that this person is addicted because they're weak or because they have like a moral failing. And it's not a real disease. Like if you could just, have some more self-control, buddy, you'd be fine, right? That was kind of the idea. And addicts were thought of as, you know, weak or moral failures for the large part of the last 100 years. And only recently has that kind of shifted. Um, to the view that substance addiction is a brain disease, and this is now widely accepted by the neuroscience and health community. And so people now get treatment, can be diagnosed with a disease, an addiction disease, and receive proper treatment for that. Some criticisms of the disease view are that it's kind of people worry that if we call addiction a disease, it gives people this idea that it's deterministic, like, oh, you're just gonna for sure, you have a disease, so there's nothing you can do about it. But that doesn't actually seem to be the case. Um, and some people think it fails to account for heterogeneity and remission and recovery. Some people say it places too much emphasis on the compulsive addiction of addiction, and that there's not like a specific neural signature of addiction. So we can't just put someone's brain in an fMRI and say, are they an addict or not? Right? But that's not we can't do that anyway. So, like, when you look at someone who's schizophrenic, right? If you put them in an fMRI machine, there's no neural signature for schizophrenia. There's a number of brain changes that tend to be correlated with, schizophrenia. Same thing's true of addiction. So, for example, gray matter volume, like white matter volume, just tends to be different in people who are addicted versus not. But not every addict who's addicted to a certain drug will have that brain change. So yeah. But in general, addiction is characterized as a brain disease. And yeah, but neuroscience shows that there are a lot of differences between the brains of people who are addicted to drugs versus not, and it's bidirectional. So, meaning that people who have different brains are going to be more or less likely to be addicted to drugs. But then on the other hand, people who are using drugs, it changes the brain's function and structure. And so then you're more likely to use drugs. So it's a little bit of like a circular pattern. So we'll talk about some of those more genetics influences on like predisposition kind of things, and then also structural consequences of functional consequences over time of repeated drug use. Okay, so one classic kind of well accepted view model of drug addiction is this idea that addiction is a disease of the brain's reward system. So in this model, addiction is caused because drugs themselves hijack our brain's reward circuitry. And then over time, they decrease our brain's ability to experience reward and also to um, yeah, and to manage stress. So, although initial drug experimentation is largely like a voluntary behavior, right? So, you're at a party, you're offered drugs, you're deciding whether or not to take it or not. They would argue that over time, once you start using the drugs, um, your brain becomes kind of addicted to them and dependent on them, and you can't experience pleasure or uh, any kind of reward without that drug. It becomes your only way of experiencing that. So the key components of this model are that drug use over time is going to decrease the sensitivity of your reward systems in your brain. We'll talk about the reward systems in a second. And also, drug use enhances sensitivity to memory circuits. that actually lead to conditioned responses to drug cues. So that's like, even if you don't take the drug itself, you find the paraphernalia associated with taking that drug's very rewarding. So, you're using cocaine, you find the straw or the dollar bill that you're using to snort it, you get that reward um, experience. Also, addiction influences kind of executive control. We'll talk about the mesocortical system. And so it also weakens kind of self regulation and leads to negative mood, which then feeds back into more addiction behavior. So let's kind of dig into that a little bit. So the drugs, amazingly, I didn't know this. I did not know that every single drug that we take, I was thinking I was going to have to give like a separate part of the lecture on, nicotine versus cannabis versus this, and they all are going to have different effects on the brain. And while it's true that they do have different effects on the brain, there's so much shared variance. Every single drug of abuse is feels good because it activates the dopaminergic system, so your dopamine system. And there's really three key neurotransmitters that the drugs are working with. So the first one is dopamine. Dopamine, we haven't really talked about in this class yet, which so I'm glad actually we're talking about it now. It's the key neurotransmitter involved in reward processing and pleasure. It's released in your brain when something feels good. And so we like dopamine, don't we? Glutamate is the most abundant excitatory neurotransmitter, just meaning that it's leading other areas of the brain or neurotransmitters to work, to function. And so it's key for memory formation and creating changes in the brain with development or experience. So you need glutamate, for example, to do like neural pruning in your synapses over in early development when you're an infant. You need glutamate to helps to function to get you to make new memories. And lots of drugs, because they activate the reward system and dopamine release, it also causes an increase in glutamate release, which means that any stimulus in your environment, anything that's happened in association with that drug use, your body's like, oh, this is great. What happened before this that, then I can get this again? Makes sense evolutionarily, right? Because let's imagine you get some unexpected reward, like, you run across a tree and it's just covered in, delicious fruit. You definitely want to remember like everything you did to get to that tree. And so the same thing's true with drug experiences that are so rewarding. They're so pleasurable. You're going to get more memory consolidation and long-term memory consolidation thanks to glutamate. Another big player is GABA, or as it's commonly known, or however you would say that, GABA amino butyric acid. GABA is interesting because it's kind of like it's a inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. So glutamate's like getting other processes. It's like saying, "Hey, store this in memory," getting stuff working. So excitatory. GABA is inhibitory. So it actually GABA blocks, for example, the expression of dopamine. So it's a major inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain, and because of this, it modulates reward. So it can block the production of dopamine and it can block the production of glutamate. And so in that sense, it can block reward or memory. And if we inhibit GABA, then we can get more dopamine and more glutamate. So, in this way, some drugs work directly on the dopamine system by increasing dopamine production, but other drugs work indirectly by changing GABA amounts. And I'll show you the drugs that do that in just a second. So, in general, the things that affect drug use kind of fall into three basic categories. So, the first is like incentive salience. So how much do you enjoy the drug you're taking? So variations in your, dopaminergic system obviously are going to be risk factors for whether or not you develop the disease. Executive function, so your ability to regulate your behavior, is also involved. And then finally, negative emotionality. So when we're thinking about biomarkers or things that are going to be influencing whether or not someone becomes addicted to drugs or not, individual differences in that, they usually fall into those three major categories. Um, yes. Let's see. Yeah. Um, so drugs of abuse, um, uh, ones that can influence the dopamine system directly are nicotine, cocaine, methamphetamines, and marijuana. All those, when you take them, they increase the production of dopamine, and that's kind of how they get us feeling good. Um, drugs that act indirectly on dopamine by inhibiting GABA are opioids and alcohol. But it kind of, six a dozen of one, half a dozen of the other. It's kind of the same thing, right? If you're blocking GABA production, that's going to increase dopamine indirectly. Okay. So if you remember our brain lecture a long time ago, we talked about kind of the three major areas of the brain. So we've got like the brain stem, which does like a lot of our basic stuff, like keeps our heart beating, and our spinal cord that's doing all the basic stuff. Then on top of that, and that's our oldest brain, on top of that is the limbic region. That's the region we're going to mostly talk about today, which controls like emotion and behavioral responses to cues like pleasure, pain. And then on top of that is the cortex. And the cortex is like executive function. It's a newer brain and is associated with like self control, planning, self referential thought. You're using your cortex right now. So the limbic system's kind of this middle ground between this emotional powerhouse between kind of that ancient brainstem and then our newer cortical areas. So within the limbic system is the mesolimbic dopamine system. This is the body's central reward processing center in the brain. And so it's made up of a number of structures, and we'll go into those a little bit here. But before we do that, the big kind of neurotransmitter involved in the system is dopamine. So, dopamine plays a large role in the ability to regulate or influence reward expectations, motivations, emotions. So, when we release dopamine in the brain, it has projections to a lot of different places. It influences our memory, it influences our executive function, it influences our uh, vigilance towards new environmental stimuli. And so when you take those, so this is an fMRI of they brought people into the lab and they gave them cocaine, and they just measured kind of dopamine release in response to that. And what you can see is, people who get cocaine, they have increases in activation in the ventral striatum. The ventral striatum, if you recall, is the body's like pleasure area, and specifically the ventral tegmental area, which we'll talk about in just a second. It's just part of the ventral striatum. And so when you get a drug, any drug that there's a drug of abuse, you're going to see an increase in dopamine, and this is going to lead to a cascade of changes in the brain. And actually, people who have more kind of dopamine response to a cocaine injection are experiencing more of a high from that. If you look at the time course, so this is a study where they brought people in and did like methamphetamine use, and you can see percentage of peak kind of dopamine release in that B graph there. And you can see that dopamine peaks in about 10 minutes after you first take the drug. You get kind of that euphoric feeling. All right, so let's dig into the mesolimbic system in the brain. So the reward powerhouse in the brain. It's made up of a bunch of areas, but we're going to focus on the key ones. So that's the ventral tegmental area. That's a part of the ventral striatum, the medial forebrain bundle, the nucleus accumbens, and then other limbic regions in the brain. So the ventral tegmental area is where it all starts. It is part of the ventral striatum and is the area of the brain where you're getting a lot of, where actually you're producing dopamine. So there's a bunch of dopamine cells there, and they will produce dopamine and start kind of that cascade. There's projections from the ventral tegmental area neurons that help to send a signal. The dopamine, once it's released, goes along the neurons and hits the nucleus accumbens through the medial forebrain bundle. It just helps to connect the dopaminergic neurons in the VTA to the nucleus accumbens. It's not on your study guide, just a fun fact to know that there's those bundles of neurons. What that means, though, is that like this is acting fast. So as soon as dopamine's released, your nucleus accumbens is going to find out. Your nucleus accumbens, the nucleus accumbens is part of the ventral striatum. The ventral tegmental area is not. But the nucleus accumbens is the brain's main pleasure center in the brain. And it responds to all types of different pleasures. So when you eat chocolate, ventral striatum. When you, eat, have drugs, ventral striatum. So this is the area of the brain that's processing how pleasurable something is. From the nucleus accumbens, there's projections to different areas in the brain, other areas of the limbic system. So the septum, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. So the main one that I researched was the hippocampus. Hippocampus is really important for memory consolidation. And so that's where you're going to be doing like a lot of the learning that comes along. So if something's really great, you want to remember it. And so that's why when your reward system is activated, memory consolidation is more likely to occur. Um, and then also amygdala activation. So the amygdala, we think of it typically as like a fear response center, and it does respond to fearful stimuli, but it's more like the vigilance center of the brain and kind of attunes the brain to outside stimuli. So it's kind of making you more aware of both positive and negative things that might be associated with that great drug experience you just had. So you just got all this dopamine. From an evolutionary perspective, your mind should be like, what the heck just happened? This was incredible. Let's do this again. Anything that happened before or after, I want to remember. So if I see that again, I can get this experience again. So it's increasing vigilance towards those areas. Let's see. Anything else I want to say about that? Also, part of the limbic system that's activated in the reward system, it's not on the slide, but is the hypothalamus. So we know the hypothalamus, that's the H in the HPA axis. And so the hypothalamus is kind of the brain-body connection. It's the part of the brain that's really connecting the brain to the body. And so that's also going to be related to kind of motivational systems associated with seeking out drugs in the future and kind of getting you motivated to find that experience again. All right, so that's the main, that's the mesolimbic system. But there's also this mesocortical pathway. So when dopamine's released from the ventral tegmental area, it also, there's projections, and that's the orange neurons on the graph. There's connections from that kind of limbic area, the ventral tegmental area, up into the prefrontal cortex. And so the prefrontal cortex is going to be including, leading to uh, judgment, planning, motivation. And so that's one reason why it makes sense that when you're taking drugs, that's obviously going to be influencing your risk taking behavior, your reward seeking behavior, and planning abilities as well through the mesocortical system. So you can see that, I guess, if there's one takeaway, is that taking these drugs has widespread effects on the brain in the moment, but also over time, which we'll talk about now. Here, any questions? Why don't we take a little break? We're going to watch a video that kind of goes over the main areas in the brain associated with the effects of drugs. So it'll hopefully recap stuff, but otherwise, questions? Great. Did you guys know all this already? A little bit, I was like, this is going to be very basic.
I knew some of it, but um not really even from taking psych classes, just more um
So
I
some
don't
of it,
know.
but not all of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. That's a perfect way to learn then. Yeah, well, I didn't really realize that there were like, um, I didn't really know what GABA and glutamate had to do with it. I knew dopamine was involved, but that was kind of cool to learn about. Um, yeah, okay.
I learned about GABA more recently, um, because my sister started taking like a vitamin called like Pharma GABA or something like that. And she asked me to look into it and research. And because I was like, I've never heard of that. And so I started reading some articles about it helping with like anxiety and stuff. And it had talked about how it drugs act on that part of the brain. But before
Yeah.
that, I didn't know.
Yeah, I don't know about that work on vitamins. And I have a friend who was taking that too. And I was like, I know I see those vitamins at the store. I don't know. Like, it's kind of like taking melatonin or any other hormone. I don't think it's really well studied. But yeah, some studies, right, show that it's helps to reduce anxiety and depression. I've seen that, which kind of makes sense if one of the main symptoms of depression is kind of lack of motivation or like failure of the brain to like activate, then it would make sense that GABA could influence that. But it just seems to me like GABA does so many things in the brain. I'm like a little scared of messing with my chemistry like that. But
Yeah, definitely.
yeah, and
And
you
I'm
could
like,
just buy it. You don't need like a prescription.
right, right. And I'm even like, just, I don't know, skeptical about not all vitamins, but like when I was starting my prenatals, I remember telling my doctor, I feel like I'm on too high of a dose because I'm like wired like I've had a bunch of caffeine.
Hmm.
And they were like, it's probably just your body adjusting to like the level of like folic acid and B12 and all that. And eventually it wore off. But um, yeah, I just felt like because B12 will give you energy.
Hmm.
And so I felt like maybe my B12 was super low before and I'm supposed to be that energized. I don't know. Or it could have
Hmm.
been pregnancy hormones too.
I never heard that. That's really interesting. Yeah, I think if you are deficient, that makes a lot of sense. But yeah, there's so much we don't know about diet and the brain that it's just, yeah, could fill a
Yeah.
whole class on that. Okay. So we talked about kind of the brain areas involved, but let's talk about like the psychology involved with taking drugs rather. So initially, right, you take a drug and dopamine neurons in the ventral tegmental area respond in the presence of that drug. Um, but if there's a cue before you take the drug, um, your neurons will start to fire in response to that cue instead of the reward. So the classic example, right, of this is like Pavlov's dogs. So this is classical, this is conditioning, you know. And so and actually, if the reward fails to occur, over time, the dopamine neurons, so if you see a cue, let's say, let's imagine the cue is um, something you usually pair with taking drugs. So that might be what? Like maybe you're going to a party and you always drink a lot when you do that. And so you paired kind of the reward dopamine response you get from drinking alcohol with a social environment. And so then just the social environment itself, or maybe that's not the best cue since that's rewarding itself. So a cue could be like, a straw that you might use to snort cocaine. You see the straw, you're already starting to get dopamine increases just from the cue of the drug. And actually, the conditioning is even stronger when sometimes not always the reward follows it. So if the reward only follows it sometimes, then you're going to get a stronger conditioning response. But of course, if you never get the rewards, you only see straws all the time, and then never get the dopamine release over time. The conditioning will do extinction. So and um And so in this way, people who are addicted start to seek out the cues that are leading them to engage in getting that dopamine burst. So seeking out not just the drug itself, but things that they've been associating with taking the drug. So Um, in terms of functional anatomy of reward pathways, another big predictor of drug use is this thing called incentive salience. So the mesolimbic pathway enhances the motivational properties of cues predictive of rewards. So when you're getting that dopamine release, right, it's going to enhance glutamate production, specifically in regions of the brain associated with motivation, and also projecting into areas of the brain that are related to kind of planning and seeking out that behavior in the future. So things like in the amygdala. So you're going to be more vigilant towards ways to get the drug. And so motivational states increase the incentive salience of reward and reward related cues. So just means that when you're taking drugs, other factors um, in your brain are going to be, you're going to have more memory for it. You're going to have more vigilance towards cues associated with taking the drug as well. There's, of course, the high that comes from the drug itself. So all this stuff we've been talking about before is not related to what you would or I would experience as a high when taking the drug. But there is, of course, that. So that euphoria associated from the dopamine release. So the nucleus accumbens is going to be processing all that dopamine, and that's going to feel really good. Most research on this is on cocaine and amphetamines. And we know, of course, that these drugs do make us feel really good. Both cause substantial increase in synaptic production and firing of dopamine neurons. And if we block dopamine in the brain, in the nucleus accumbens, so we like wipe that out in rat studies, drugs become a lot less pleasurable. And then finally, in the functional anatomy of reward pathways, there's the anticipation of the reward and habit formation. So, because of the reciprocal connection between the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, um, so when you activate, the reward circuitry, you're also activating kind of your executive areas and your memory areas more so than you normally would. And so you're making memories, very strong memories of that drug experience. Um, and those then are going to form the basis of kind of craving and habit formation because your body just remembers how great that high was and you need it, you're craving it and wanting it again. When people have executive function deficits, so for example, in the case of like chronic stress, or if let's say you have a genetic component where you're low on executive regulation, you're going to be a lot more likely to become addicted to drugs just because the incentive salience or uh, you're going to have a harder time regulating your kind of craving for those drugs and yeah, seeking them out. And I'm not really going to go into this that much because Selena is actually going to cover with THC and its effects long term in the brain. But it is really important to note that just in drugs in general, the more you take over time, the more a lot of this reward system in your brain starts going awry. So when you have these dopamine bursts all the time, it actually leads to changes in gene expression and makes you less sensitive to dopamine over time. So this is just a study by Vocal that showed you see decreased dopamine brain reactivity in marijuana abusers compared to non-abusers. So in this study, they compared the brains of people who are chronic marijuana users versus not. And they gave them a substance which should increase dopamine, right? And they found that marijuana abusers had attenuated dopamine responses um, compared to controls. And part of the reason for this is just that it's kind of like the HBA axis model, actually. It's this wear and tear model that when you're taking drugs that give you so much dopamine, right, your body actually downregulates receptors for dopamine and expression of neurons that would make dopamine. So it's turning off gene receptors uh, and RNA and making less of dopamine itself. And so because your body has so much of it, it's like, oh, we got too much. So we're going to downregulate production of it. And so then really your world kind of becomes gray because you're not getting a dopamine surge from normal things that you might enjoy. So for example, sex or chocolate is just not going to taste quite as good, not be quite as enjoyable as that crazy hyper physiological levels of dopamine you can get from things like taking opioids or cannabis. Um, in terms of dopamine signaling, this is not on your study guide in part. Yeah, because I wasn't, yeah, it's just too much. We're covering so much. But basically, it really matters the effect of drugs on like you taking a drug, if the likelihood of you getting addicted to it has a lot to do with the exact way that it influences dopamine in your brain. So dopamine can be released in this kind of phasic way, which is like a short bursts, kind of like floods and then stops. Or there's some things that can lead to tonic dopamine increases. So that's more lower level dopamine over longer periods of time. And what they've shown in studies is that drugs like opioids or drugs like cocaine that give that phasic signaling, that burst really, really fast, are much more likely to lead to kind of that conditioned response and leading to um, kind of pairing cues like the straw or a social environment with that dopamine release, making it more like you're going to seek that out. Um, the tonic signaling of dopamine, so things that like slower release drugs are going to be better at leading to changes in working memory and other executive processes over time. And most drugs, right, have a mix of both in there. And so it's like a double trouble scenario um, when you're activating those things. So just again, drugs obviously can create a conditioned response in the classic conditioning experience like Pavlov's dogs. That's where the stimulus itself starts getting a cue of the stimulus gets a reward. And so when you put an addict in a PET scan, you show them a cue for the drug, they're actually going to start having a dopamine response even before they get the drug itself. And sometimes the cue response can be even more powerful than the dopamine burst they get from the drug itself. Sometimes, not others. And so this kind of helps explain why the chronic use of addictive substances can lead to powerful condition responses, and why drug addicts would seek out people, place, and things that remind them of their drug use. And then that in turn, we know behaviorally as health psychologists, makes it much more likely that they're going to end up using drugs. And so this is a huge problem with people who are in recovery and trying to avoid taking substances, is all the connections, between the dopamine release and drug use and changes in memory. These memories are very, very powerful. And our body is really good at remembering when stuff felt really good and making us want to do that again. So it's very tricky. So addicts often have to try to work to reduce kind of exposure to those cues that would then set off the kind of cascade in their mesolimbic and mesocortical systems. All right. So this is a video by the NIH that just kind of covers everything we covered just one more time, because I know it was a lot of biology and terms and stuff. It's just going to go over everything we covered. So it's not going to be anything really new, but it's meant just to be as a review. So just give me a second to put that on. Let's see. And then we'll go through and go through the study guide questions just to make sure that we didn't miss anything. Let me make sure I share my thing. Okay. Let me know if you guys can hear this. Maybe it's quiet now.
The brain is central to our existence.
Can you guys hear that? Danielle?
Yeah, we can hear it.
Okay, cool.
It generates everything we feel and do. It processes information coming from the outside world, such as the smell of food, and from inside the body, such as sensations of hunger. Using all this information, the brain then makes an appropriate response, driving behaviors that help us survive. For example, getting something to eat. Deep within the brain is a set of structures called the limbic system. The limbic system lies below the cortex, or outer layer of the brain. In evolutionary terms, the limbic system is quite old compared with the cortex. One limbic system structure, the hippocampus, helps us form memories and learn. The amygdala contributes to emotions. The striatum is crucial to forming habits, routines of behavior that we tend to do without thinking, and processing reward. The limbic system contains the brain's reward circuit or pathway. The reward circuit links together a number of brain structures that control and regulate our ability to feel pleasure. Feeling pleasure motivates us to repeat behaviors, such as eating, and other actions that are critical to our existence. A reward, or something linked with a reward, activates cells in the ventral tegmental area, or VTA, in the midbrain. This sets off a chain reaction of activation in the reward circuit. The long projections of VTA cells go to an area called the ventral striatum, or VS. The activation of cells quickly reaches a key part of the VS called the nucleus accumbens. The nucleus accumbens is often called the brain's pleasure center. When activated, each cell generates an electrical signal. That electrical signal causes the cell to release molecules of neurotransmitter, which act as chemical messengers. Those chemical messages are received by another cell. This is how cells communicate with each other in an activated neural circuit. The brain has many different neurotransmitters, which serve multiple functions. The small gap between the sending and receiving cells is called the synapse. The cell sending the message is presynaptic. The receiving cell, postsynaptic. In the presynaptic cell, the electrical signal causes changes. Some packets or vesicles that store neurotransmitter migrate to the cell membrane, merge with it, open up, and release neurotransmitter molecules into the synapse. In the reward pathway, dopamine neurons release the neurotransmitter dopamine. The released dopamine molecules drift across the synapse. They link up with proteins called dopamine receptors on the surface of the receiving cell. These receptors span the receiving cell's membrane, with part on the outside and part on the inside of the cell. When dopamine binds in the receptor's exterior part, like a key into a lock, it triggers a cascade of events inside the receiving cell. Other proteins attached to the interior part of the receptor carry the signal onward within the cell. When there is excess dopamine, and as these molecules drop off receptors, they are free in the synapse again. Some dopamine molecules re-enter the sending cell via a special protein called a dopamine transporter on the sending cell's membrane. Back inside the cell, these dopamine molecules are now available for re-release. In a healthy brain, there is always a moderate level of dopamine in the synaptic space, even in the absence of rewarding stimuli. When a reward is encountered, such as food, the presynaptic cell releases a larger amount of dopamine in a sudden burst. Dopamine transporters will then quickly remove the excess, returning the amount of dopamine to the original level. Dopamine surges in response to natural rewards help the brain learn, adapt, and navigate a complex world. Normal cycling of dopamine release occurs in the VS, activating the entire striatum and limbic areas. Activation of the reward pathway has a far-reaching impact throughout the brain. From the VS, the reward pathway extends to the prefrontal cortex, or PFC. The PFC powers our ability to think, plan, solve problems, and make decisions. The reward system influences the limbic system and the areas of the cortex that process sensory and motor information. Reward system activation also influences the cerebellum in the back of the brain, which affects coordination of movement as well as attention. Normal activation of the reward system creates a physical imprint on the brain that links certain stimuli with rewards that satisfy biological needs, such as food, and make us want to fulfill those needs by seeking out those rewards. Once the brain associates a stimulus with a reward, just seeing the stimulus can trigger a surge of dopamine in the reward system. When someone first uses cocaine, the drug quickly enters the brain, where it blocks the transporters on the presynaptic cell. Since dopamine cannot re-enter the presynaptic cell, it begins to accumulate in the synapse, where it can reach abnormally high levels and remain there much longer than usual. the postsynaptic cell becomes hyperactivated, which produces a feeling of euphoria. This creates an incredibly powerful association between cocaine and pleasure, making a person want to repeat the experience of taking the drug. When someone first uses methamphetamine, the drug quickly enters the brain. At low doses, meth blocks the re-entry of dopamine into the presynaptic cell, just like cocaine does. But unlike cocaine, higher doses of meth can increase the release of dopamine from the cell, leading to much, much more dopamine in the synapse, where it becomes trapped because meth prevents the transporters from removing it. Because so much dopamine remains in the synapse for such long periods of time, the postsynaptic cell is activated to dangerously high levels, causing the user to experience powerful feelings of euphoria, making meth incredibly addictive. Using cocaine or meth has far-reaching consequences on the brain. Drugs alter how the reward center communicates with the rest of the brain, affecting emotions, movement, reasoning, and decision-making. The repeated, frequent use of these drugs can change the actual wiring throughout the brain. These changes will eventually prevent a chronic user from feeling the same euphoria they experienced when first using the drug. Instead, they need to take the drug just to feel normal, and they feel compelled to take it, no matter the consequences. This is when chronic drug use becomes an addiction.
Okay, guys. So I don't know, just some review. What we covered. And I think we could take a break if we want. But before we take a break, I wanted to just go over the lecture notes study guide that questions. So the first one is the major components of the model of addiction as a disease in the brain. And so we covered that. Know the three major neurotransmitters, how they're influenced by drug use and their general functions. We went over that. Know which drugs impact dopamine systems directly versus indirectly. And then know the major functions of the different regions in the brain associated with the mesolimbic dopamine system. So specifically the ventral tegmental area, nucleus accumbens, and then the limbic areas we talked about. So hippocampus, that's supposed to be hypothalamus on there, and amygdala. And then the mesocortical pathway, the major players involved in that, and reward prediction, error signaling, and incentive salience. So do you guys want to go over any of these again? No? I would recommend taking notes on the lecture note study guide during the lecture, so you don't have to go back and do it. That's kind of what the study guides are designed to help you with. So hopefully, I'm just such a great teacher. It's like, no. Or are you guys tired because it's Friday and it's like 3 p.m., which I also feel.
I
Any
always
questions? Go ahead.
fill out the study guide like during,
Mm-hmm.
um, but I think it would be most helpful if I also review it afterwards, even maybe later in the week, because I found when studying for the midterm that like I had forgotten a lot of
Mm-hmm.
what we learned because I wasn't actively reviewing it. So I always find it helpful, and I like handwritten notes as well as, that's just how my brain works. But I always find it helpful to like take the notes during the lecture, but I'm like, okay, I need to start going back and reviewing it afterwards. That way it really sinks in.
Cool. Yeah, that's great. That's what research suggests is the best way to learn. But do you want me to cover any of these areas again, or should we take a break, or do you guys want to just finish up faster? Because you're my only two students, Selena and Danielle. And Danielle, given that your baby's sleeping, maybe we want to just keep going. Because Danielle.
Yeah, I'm cool with that. Selena
Okay.
is too.
Yeah, keep going. It's fine. Okay. There's not that much more actually, that I planned on covering today. So the next part of the lecture is about kind of individual difference factors that are going to be related to whether or not you become an addict. So obviously these are going to be genetics, or start there, stress, and then also social context and environmental context. One thing that's not on this should be like accessibility of the drug itself. So this is one thing that's like, with you know, marijuana use, right? It's legal now, so it's way easier to get. So you could just buy it, and that's why actual alcohol and marijuana are the number one drugs of abuse, because they are easiest to get. They're legal. So we'll probably be seeing more marijuana addiction in the coming years, unfortunately. Hey, Jessica.
Hi, sorry I'm late.
No problem. We just covered the biology of um, drugs, what they do in the brain, the rewards and
The nucleus accumbens and whatnot.
yeah, the mesolimbic system, the mesocortical system. And so I'm recording this lecture, so you can just check that first part out later. But we're on part 2. So let's first go into genetics. Genetics actually play a huge role in the likelihood that someone is going to become an addict. And so I think they don't get as much traction as they deserve. So, for example, alcohol addiction, a meta-analysis of twins and adoption studies has shown that the estimated heritability is about 50%, while estimates from opiate addiction are even higher. So the graph here shows kind of the effect size of a bunch of different twin studies that have looked at, of course, the concordance between like identical twins versus non-identical twins, or siblings that are adopted together, like twins that are adopted together versus apart, to try and parse out the effect that's genes, the effects that environment, and the effects that are both genes and environment. And so genetics play a very large role in they have a bigger effect size actually than shared environment, or unique environment. This is just another way of looking at this. So this is kind of like a correlation coefficient. If you between genes that, so in they did a genome-wide association study, and they looked at because most people who are using drugs, a lot of them are using multiple drugs, and given the fact that biologically speaking, in terms of why it's rewarding, cocaine is not that different from methamphetamine, is not that different than opium. It's because it all increase are acting on this mesocortical system, right? So it makes sense that people who are using one drug, why not use another as well? And so here's the genes that are in common between genes that predict one substance use disorder also predict other substance use disorders. So if you look like at cannabis, the blue lines there are kind of the shared genetic variants associated with diseases. And so you can see that there's a huge amount of heritability going on. So if you're at high risk, if you're taking cannabis, if you're using cannabis, you're going to be at higher risk for cocaine, hallucinogens, sedatives, stimulants, and opioids. And it's shared genes. So the same genes that are predicting your liking of cannabis are going to also predict your liking of hallucinogens or other things. And this kind of goes into what we know about the literature is that, people tend to use who are substance abuse users or have an addiction disorder are more likely to be using kind of not just one drug. So the most common combo is alcohol and cannabis, and then cannabis and illicit stimulants, then alcohol and prescription opioids, and so forth. And that makes sense in terms of the genes that are going to predict risk for one are going to predict risk for the other because it's the same mesocortical system, mesolimbic system that's being activated by all these different drugs. Hey, Natalie.
Hi.
Hey, I know we had that meeting for Matthew's project, the longitudinal project. I didn't think about that when I was scheduling this, but I'm recording this lecture, so I'll post it right after this, and so you can check out the first part. But we're talking right now about the genetic influences on addiction disorders.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So to summarize, the heritability of addiction disorders is really high, between 40 and 60%, depending on the study and the drug. It's really high. When you look at the environmental factors that are shared, so if you look at that last slide, the yellow is kind of shared environmental factors. There's really very few that are going to predict all the drug use disorders. Whereas you look at those big blue lines, those are the same genes predicting use of multiple different disorders. So the shared genetic variance is real with addictive disorders. Addiction disorder, like every single trait we study in humans, is polygenic, meaning multiple genes are affecting it, and especially genes that are related to reward processing, stress processing, and executive control processing, right? And so lots of genes are going to have small effect sizes, and people who are predisposed to addiction disorders just draw the short straw and just have more of these high risk alleles. There are hundreds, thousands of alleles that have been associated with higher risk of substance abuse disorders. And so just like with height, right? So there's many genes that predict your height. And if you're tall, it's because you've got more of those high risk alleles. Same thing's true of substance abuse disorder. You're going to be at much higher risk if you have higher a proportion of these high risk alleles. There are some exceptions. There's only like one example of a silver bullet gene that will prevent you from being addicted to alcohol. And that's this ALDH2 gene that's common it's a polymorphism in East Asian cultures, more prevalent in those populations. It's a mutation that makes it more difficult for people to process alcohol. Because of that, they're incredibly sensitive to it. And so just even a little bit of alcohol will get them alcohol poisoning. And so turns out people with this allele that makes it pretty much impossible for them to process alcohol or have very low rates of alcoholism. So this is one gene that prevents you from having alcoholism. There's very low rates in these individuals. If you have one, it's also dose dependent. So if you have one copy of the allele that makes it difficult to process alcohol, but you have a working copy, a regular, more common copy, you have slightly lower risk for alcohol disorder. And this is kind of the characteristic, if you've ever heard of the term Asian glow. So people who get really red when they're drinking typically will have one of these non-working alleles, and they're at low risk for alcohol use disorders because of it. But that's every other gene maybe gives you a 1% increased risk of having the substance abuse disorder. It's not huge like that one gene. So genes implicated in addiction tend to be related to reward processing. And those can influence genes that would influence syntax structure, or receptor function Also, obviously, polymorphisms in the dopamine molecule itself would be related to that. So SNPs and dopamine receptor genes, cannabinoid receptor genes, genes that relate to also epigenetic changes in expression of receptors of let's say cells that make dopamine in the ventral tegmental area, for example. And that's actually one of the ways in which chronic drug use affects dopamine sensitivity, is by changing the genes, which ones get turned on and turned off. Stress processing genes would be things like CRH, ACTH, and cortisol, right? 3 hormones we know that are involved in HPA axis. Well, guess what? Polymorphisms and the corticotropin receptor gene predicted. That's a big one that I see a lot with them. And so people who have polymorphisms in their CRH receptor that make them, slightly less likely or more likely to release CRH in response to a stress, that's going to modulate their risk for diseases of substance abuse. Executive control, that's harder genetically to pin down. There's a lot of work showing that, yes, executive control, ability to regulate your behavior is certainly heritable. What genes exactly would be associated with that? I'm not sure so much. There's a bunch that I was looking at, but like one might, for example, be variation in the serotonin receptor gene associated with like risk taking and sensation seeking, making it more difficult to modulate, control yourself around rewarding stimulus. All right. Yeah. So that's our genetics section. Let's move on to kind of the social and like stress section. So as you guys know, the United States had a long history of a war on drugs and kind of this, zero tolerance policy. We need to just shame people, scare people into not taking drugs. And it was part based on this assumption that kind of everybody who uses a drug is going to become an addict. And so because of that, we absolutely need to have this policy that's just an abstinence approach, much like, some misguided ideas of sex education. This idea was based on early studies in rats, where they kind of would put rats in a cage and give them access to a drug, so cocaine in their water, or some meth in their food, and all these rats in the cages, given free access. If we let people just have free access to drugs, was the idea. These rats, all of them became addicted and eventually died. They killed themselves. And so from this, it was like, oh my gosh, like humans, we're looking at this as humans. If we give people access to drugs, they're going to use them to excess, and we're all going to be addicts and we're all going to die. But there was newer researchers like Bruce Alexander's and others had the thought, well, you're putting these rats in like there's not other sources of joy in their lives. They're in cages alone. They're really, really bored. What would happen if we gave rats the access to these drugs, but in a more naturalistic setting? So they kind of created this rat paradise where there was other rats to mate with, there was toys, there was good food, there was light dark cycles, so they're not as stressed, their circadian biology is being respected, all this stuff. What happens over time? And so when you did this, the rats actually would use the drugs sometimes, but none of the rats in this study really became addicted and died. So this kind of challenged the idea that everyone's going to be an addict if you give them free access to drugs. And when we look at humans, right? Most people who experiments with drugs are not going to become addicts, but a small proportion of them will, right? And so we do need to obviously study that. I don't mean to minimize it at all, but it is a fact of life that most people who try drugs experimentally are not going to become addicts. And those people who are the ones who are experimenting with drugs and not developing these substance abuse disorders tend to be socially connected to family and friends and loved ones, have good quality environments, lower poverty. We went over the CDC's predictors of drug addiction, right? When you look at predictors of people who are more likely to become addicts, there tend to be unemployed, divorced, unmarried, lonely, socially isolated, rejected, and kind of just in general coming from poorer environments, being isolated. And so the idea is that, like, maybe we can think about this as people who are going to become addicts are kind of like rats living in bad cages, that these environmental factors where you're pretty miserable, there's not a lot of sources of joy in your life. Drugs are much more likely to become a source of addiction. Did someone want to say something? Where's nicotine on this? I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
you were showing this graph and it was talking about like the most common combinations of drugs. And I noticed that nicotine wasn't on there next to alcohol or cannabis or anything else. So I was just,
Yeah, nicotine does increase dopamine, just like all the other fun drugs. Nicotine has effects on the body beyond just because it's not thought of as like when you're it's not listed on those drug addiction things. Like people can be addicted to cigarettes, but it's not thought of as a drug of abuse. So it's not on those lists, which is probably really wrong. You're right. Good call. Oversight on my part.
I mean, it's interesting how it's almost like human blindness to it. It's almost like cognitive dissonance. Like, I wonder if the person who made that is a smoker or something. And they thought, oh, no, nicotine doesn't belong on here.
No, it's not one of the ones that are not thought of as drug. I mean, coffee could also be on this list, right? Yeah, I wonder if coffee increases dopamine. I didn't look that up. Did someone want to Google that for me? I don't know. I'm not sure. Anywho, and so there was also this idea that once you're addicted, like no one would ever spontaneously stop. And again, that's from those rats in the cages alone, right? Once they get them physically addicted to cocaine in their water, they never just stop. And so there was another series of studies that came along and made the cages better for those rats too. And in fact, when you put those addicted rats into the rat paradise, a lot of them just decide to wean themselves naturally from the drug. So they'll still use it every once in a while. They'll even use it and then go out and mate a little bit, or like when they're going to be social, kind of like humans do. But they definitely decreased their use of it. Now, not all the rats did, so some of the rats still died, suggesting that there's definitely a predisposition, a biological component, individual variation in that, but a good kind of caveat. What did you find out? Yeah, caffeine enhances dopamine signaling in the brain. Yeah, of course. What we covered before you came in was just that every single drug seems to increase dopamine. It's like the thing. It's a mesocortical limbic system. It's all of them do, so I would guess, which made it easier to do this, less biology for us to understand. Now, of course, every drug's going to have a slightly different effect, but we're just covering the basics today. Really, really the basics. So again, the addicted rats who were socially isolated did all die eventually when given access to drugs, but socially connected rats, when they're addicted, they naturally started to wean themselves over time and started using the drug less and less. And so I think this nicely sums up the recent research, which suggests that a lot of the individual difference factors in addiction use disorders has to do with these things of were in a bad cage, just like those rats who were abusing the drug. When you don't have access to other sources of pleasure, you especially if you don't feel socially connected, that's a big one. If you're isolated, lonely, feel socially rejected, those are huge risk factors for developing an addiction to a substance. So what does this mean for how we treat addicts in the US? So what do we do when people are addicts? We put people in jail because they're caught using drugs. Is this a good idea to reduce addiction? I mean, of course not, based on the research. You're literally putting someone in a bad cage because they were addicted to a drug. Like I couldn't imagine a worse treatment for somebody. So what could we do socially to help decrease addiction? Um, yeah, so one idea is instead of socially rejecting addicts, stigmatizing them, locking them up, um, what if we socially connected them, tried to improve their cage? And to be fair to the US policy, in the last 20 years, there's been, you guys would know more about this than me, there's been a huge push to like use the actual neuroscience and use the actual data that we have to design addiction treatment programs that finally work. So you're never just gonna, scare people, shame people into not taking drugs. That's actually the worst thing you could do. You need to socially reintegrate them, make them feel less stigmatized, and give them access to safe ways to manage their addiction until they're ready to wean themselves from it. So in 1999, maybe you didn't know this, 1% of the population of Portugal was addicted to heroin. They had a huge heroin problem. It was crazy. And so they didn't know what to do. They kept locking people up and punishing them, and it was just not working. And so the government got together and created this panel of experts and kind of went over this research and was like, okay, well, I guess what we need to do is in 2001, they decriminalized all drugs and invested heavily in reconnecting addicts with jobs and support groups. So, for example, they actually paid companies to hire addicts and they subsidized their salary. And so that it became like really cheap to hire addicts and then gave them jobs, support groups, job training, trying to reintegrate them into society. And so if you look at the drug heroin induced deaths, they dropped rapidly, from like fourfold decline in drug related deaths. And then if you look at lifetime prevalence in the past year of drug abuse in all adults, you see, a decline based on before and after. So I wonder because this is something where this is obviously a really, really simplistic kind of story because we're going to see probably increases in cannabis use because now it's legal. But I'm curious to hear what you guys think about this decriminalization issue and how it's going to influence substance abuse disorder specifically. Like, are people going to be more likely to be addicted to meth or to drugs if we made them legal, or do you think that they would use them but not necessarily become addicted to them? What do you guys think?
I know one thing that's happened, and I don't know, this doesn't like speak to the whole question, but I know one thing is that standards have definitely risen in people and that they want to know where it's coming from. They want to know where something, if it's been treated, they want to know if it's been lab tested. Things have become like kind of standardized in a way, and that I know people are steering away from kind of street cannabis, things like this, because they're like, oh, well, I can simply go to a shop and get it that's tested and approved and okay and safe. And so I don't know if that's necessarily increasing the number of people that are using. I don't think we've had really good numbers of that in the past, but I know that it's making people feel safer about it, or a lot of the people I've spoken to feel safer about it. Like my grandma loves that she can go to a dispensary instead of finding her neighbor's son to get something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a really a natural experiment. I mean, for sure, now that cannabis is legal, um, I mean, I think it would definitely, yeah, it definitely makes it safer to do drugs when they're legal and it's more, I think if we made opiates legal and, there'd be a lot less deaths from fentanyl because there wouldn't be any fentanyl in the drugs that people are taking. Um, so yeah, but also increasing access to these drugs is going to increase the proportion of people who have these predispositions and who are in a bad cage and are going to be more likely to be addicted to them. So I'm not sure. I'd be curious to think yeah, Natalie, you are the one and Selena, I'm interested to hearing from the most.
Yeah, I was gonna say, overall, it's just a very um, like multifaceted problem, multifaceted solution. I think with the decriminalizing drugs on one hand, like you mentioned, maybe you could save lives in the sense of reducing like adulterated or laced drugs with fentanyl and things like that. But I think that's only one part of the puzzle. Like the whole other thing is really having more treatment centers, so like medicated assistant treatment centers where doctors can give people opioids, which is essentially decriminalized opioids, like, but doctors are giving it to people, but it's not just like handing them out for fun, it's to people who are already addicted. So that's something I really stand by. And then also, I think dealing with it, like Portugal is a very small country compared to the United States. So doing a lot of it on like community level and what works for different communities. There's different pockets of every city and state and cut and whatever county that like might have different needs that should be focused on. So like working with the communities is really important. Um, and then also I think in general improving the quality of life for people, like nothing to even do with drugs or anything like that, but having better healthcare, better social economic benefits so that people don't have to turn to these things, higher pay, things like that. I think so. It's like a huge issue on like all the way from, like an individual level to structural levels.
Yeah, really good points, Dally. Yeah, and I think what's important to remember about the Portugal example, you're right, is they didn't just decriminalize. It's not like they just did that. And if you just looked at that picture, it'd be too simple. But they also invested a ton of money in addicts, in reconnecting them and providing opioid use centers so they could, safely. So they did a lot of these, both at the individual level and then structural level. And yeah, would it work in the US? I mean, we don't know.
Yeah, I love the points that you made too, Natalie. And I have like really mixed feelings on all of this. Um, just because I think most of you know, but I'm actually a recovering addict. And I've been clean and sober for like 8.5 years. And I before COVID, I used to go into the jails and bring recovery into the jails for the women in there. And I saw like I loved doing that. That was like the highlight of my week. Um, because you see these women who you know, are struggling with the disease and would they have made those poor choices? had they not been on drugs? You know, probably not, right? And they just wanted a better life. But jail was kind of the turning point for them. It was like they didn't hit bottom or they weren't going to stop until they were put behind bars, taken away from their kids. Um, because the sad thing about addiction, and I see it all the time in the recovery group that I go to, a few times a week, um, is that most addicts or alcoholics don't stop until they hit that bottom.
Mm.
And I know I didn't, I was homeless. Like I took me being homeless in Oakland, being in and out of like psych wards and stuff like that, in order for me to say, okay, I've had enough. And even then it was like, it's a very real disease that, takes over your whole life. So like, I think having that kind of a bridge program. So like, and they do have some stuff like that, where people can transition from, okay, they've been, separated from drugs and alcohol, which some people need, depending on the extent of their addiction and the substances used and stuff. And then having like a bridge program where they can transition from, you know, I'm talking too loud. I think the baby woke up. They can transition from, a jail setting to like a rehab, and working in the community and things like that. So, yeah, I have like kind of mixed emotions, but I like hearing everybody's perspective on it.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing your story and congratulations, Danielle. That's great. Like, good for you. And yeah, thanks for sharing that perspective. Um, I think, yeah, that you're right. Like, in some ways, that's a issue of like jail's kind of almost like a forced detox in some ways. I could see that being a positive thing. But then there's people who've argued that we should do forced detox just in general. We don't need to lock them up, but they would go to, a treatment center. So not a jail, but like a treatment facility, and making that, you know, compulsory. Because once you get to, your brain's been so hijacked by the drugs, it's just not working properly anymore. Like, you know, is there really free will anymore at all? So should we be imposing that for individuals? And yeah, having worked in like locked mental health facilities and worked with a lot of homeless people, and most of them don't want treatment. They don't want to, and so it's really a difficult ethical issue. Um, and yeah, even if we had the resources, forcing people into it, and so yeah, jail's one way of doing that, right? Even though you can get lots of drugs in jail. Um, um, yeah, but I don't know. I'm not sure. Yeah, but we don't really have it's just our culture, so like all for yourself, and it's just all about pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and we're so individualistic in our culture. We're not really set up for like dealing with drug abuse well, because yeah, yeah, no one wants to admit they're an addict. Yeah.
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 And like unfortunately it's kind of something that only like as a whole we only care as like a whole group or society once it starts affecting like um I hate to say, but richer, higher income white people.
Mhm.
Like we saw that with like crack, like no one really cared, but then like cocaine started killing people, and then they cared more, and now people care more about fentanyl and stuff because it's kind of getting in like the suburbs and things like that. So there's definitely a lot of social stigma that plays a really big role in the way that we perceive it and the way that we are like solutions and treatments. And yeah, with Jessica mentioned HIV too, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. I really like the work that you proposed in your first year talk, Natalie, about like um this kind of prophylactic approach with regards to fentanyl. And it's so controversial. We have this war on drugs mentality still. Like, and I grew up with it, you know? And so, you know, the work on, I have some slides on how terrible DARE was. We can go into that if you want, but basically DARE is this program, right, where cops came in. Did you guys, are you too young for this? Did you guys have DARE? Did cops come into your schools and kind of warn you about drugs?
I think in like 05 or 06 they changed DARE, and I got pre-changed DARE. So I did get the cops coming in, scaring you. This is what will happen to you. I did get that version.
Okay. So you guys are probably the last DARE generation then. I know you guys are different ages, but here's this big program. It costs so much money. And they tried to evaluate, like, does going into schools and scaring kids with this idea that if you ever take drugs, you'll just end up, you know, and then too, they're educating you about drugs. So my takeaway from DARE, I remember being in like 5th grade and being like, wait, like you're telling me I can go under the sink in my house and like huff these chemicals and get high? It's like good to know, you know, like not that I ever tried it, but I was like, fantastic. Like, good to know. So, you know, yeah, glue is the drug, right? Totally. Sniffing. I did try to sniff markers after it. I was like, I didn't like it, but I was like, I mean, so anyway, there was this big campaign, you know, goes in, and studies showed that it did not reduce drug use at all. In fact, if anything, it just like reduced people's self-esteem when they did do drugs. They felt really guilty about it. And so there was no kind of effect of those kind of scare tactic programs. So we can't really scare people into not doing drugs. And yeah, so I don't think we're dealing with this problem very well in the US. I don't think anyone would disagree with me. But in terms of like the biology of it, certainly finding ways in which to help individuals wean off the drugs, like in a safe and like healthy way, and then, you know, so that their reward circuitry can come back online, and then also finding other rewarding stimuli that's, you know, going to fill the place. That I don't think you can just take, you know, you need family and connection and people. We can't ostracize addicts anymore. It's going to just make it worse. And so we need the resources, but for families, because I mean, I know I have a lot of drug use in my family, and you know, it's really hard because families are just meant to deal with it alone, and there's not a lot of support for families in general. And it's like when someone's on drugs, it's really hard. When someone's addicted to like help them. So, yeah. Alrighty.
Can I just,
Natalie? Yeah.
yeah, just one more thing. And like, I think it's important that you're bringing it up in like a bio class, because one of the biggest problems is that it isn't really treated like a physiological disease. And even in terms of like healthcare, I think that practitioners could play such a bigger role in even something like cigarette smoking or like drug use. Like it's almost just like a whole other private issue for some reason. It's maybe even like treated as like psychological or something,
Right.
but I think if it was more viewed at like biologically, and like doctors or even the medical system put more effort into it, even like starting younger, like instead of putting money into the DARE program, putting it more into um like maybe kids with like risk factors or something like that, and like when they see their doctor and having like an open communication would be much better in my opinion.
Yeah. Produce like reducing child abuse, and helping like families that, you know, parents who are dealing with drug addiction problems, right? Their kids are getting a double dose because they probably are passing along genetic predispositions, as well as, you know, the stress that comes with neglect associated with parents who have substance use disorders. So yeah, we did talk about that in the beginning a little bit, that this is a brain disease of the reward system. It's kind of the, you know, and yeah, it has been really, I hate how there's this separation between the medical field, everything else, and then there's psychology, like clinical. And you're right, like drug abuse disorders have been put into the psychology bin, which is very, very under-resourced and like much more stigmatized to access. And only certain people have access to it. Like Medicare is horrible with regards to like pays for almost nothing with regards to drug treatment or yeah. So whereas, yeah, Medicare is not great if you have a chronic disease like high blood pressure or something, but at least they like know that it's a chronic disease, and so you'll need like treatment for the rest of your life. Whereas in the psychiatry or psychology field, it's like you get like five therapy sessions, and then or 2 weeks of inpatient treatment, then you're done. And it's this idea that then you're never going to have that problem again, and there's not like a constant treatment of it. So that's why Americans like have terrible mental health and terrible teeth, is because dentistry and psychiatry are separated from the rest of the medical field. And I don't know why, because aren't teeth part of the body? Isn't our brain part of the body? But yeah. See, we got in the chat. Also, sorry, I missed the slides. Yeah, the PowerPoints in CAT courses, it's week 11, right? What week is it? Pretty sure.
I see it. So I see it now. You put it in week 11.
Is
I
it
don't
week
know
10
what,
right
I
now?
don't, I have no idea, honestly, but I do see it now. I don't care what week it's in.
Yeah,
I got
it's in there. Let's see. And I will post the video of this lecture after. And it's week 11. Yeah, it's week 11. So it's in the week 11 folder. Week 10, we didn't have classes. So yeah. So I'll post this video right after this so you can check out the beginning. It's pretty rudimentary, just the basics of the reward system in the brain. I started with the caveat that I'm not an expert in this, and I'll be excited to see. Yeah, Selena's going to do for her presentation something on THC and brain. And I was like, that's going to be really cool. And so, yeah, hopefully we'll get more on this. But it was interesting to learn about this week. But this is like just a really basic intro to it. All right. So next week, we're going to talk about systems integration. Just to warn you guys, I don't plan on doing a long lecture. So do your readings because we're going to have to discuss them. And I'll give a little bit on Darwinian medicine, but it's more about tying it all together and kind of understanding how systems so I'll present a couple theories on ways that we can integrate biology and psychology across across systems. And spoiler alert, there's going to be a lot of Darwinian medicine. But most of the time I'm planning for class discussion. I know we've been kind of light in discussion this class, and it's my fault because I just felt like there was so much to teach you guys. But discussion is going to be a big part of Monday's class, regular Monday time from 2 to 4:30. And then there's Thanksgiving break, and then there's your presentation. So Adi and Jessica, you guys are first, and yeah, ready to go. So if you haven't emailed me already with your idea for your presentation, I think everybody has actually, but if you haven't, just make sure if you want feedback on that, be good. And there is a slide at the beginning of that PowerPoint that just gives a little bit of what the presentation should be. First 15 to 20 minutes is like just teaching people about you're like an educator, you're giving a lecture, and then you describe your dream studies, making sure to give specific details of like how you would actually measure your biomarker. Specifically, like even stuff like how much would it cost? You're trying to educate people on what it would take to integrate like a biological marker into your dream study. Okay. All right. So that's all there is for today, but have a great weekend, everybody. Thanks for being flexible on changing the time. Don't try to go to Panama during a pandemic. Did you know that like so many people in the conference, Jessica, got COVID? Like by the end of the when I was leaving, there was like 5 people who I met with like masks on like me who were like, yeah, we all got COVID. So
Yeah, I met Debbie O'Connor got it. I saw her leaving it with a mask on the last day. Janie at University of Colorado, she like interacted with someone who she said got it. She was trying to get home as soon as possible before she tested positive. I was like, oh my.
yeah, so it's fun. Anyway, yeah. All right, guys. Well, have a great weekend. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, guys.